Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back. We're back. Season 2, season of liberation. Woo! We took
Yes, Lord.
a little break, and we are happy to be back with you. Talking about justice and faith. There are many more things to talk about. As it turns out, oppression is still here. White supremacy is still whiting everywhere. And so we got to talk about that stuff as people of faith. So for folks who are new, I'm Pastor Lindsay Anderson, here with my colleague, Pastor Michael Johnson. And we're back to drop in every week and to talk about current issues and do a little reflection on our faith and what our faith has to say about justice and what's going on in these streets. And today we're going to start. We did not plan to have this session first, but because of what has happened in our world tonight, or last night, excuse me, we want to talk about anti-Asian violence. We want to talk about the hate that has been stalking and terrorizing our Asian siblings, especially that's been highlighted as of late, but we know that it's a long history in this country, part of the racism that our country was built on. And so we're recording this before you will see it. So yesterday, Tuesday of this week, there were 8 folks who were murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. Lone gunman, domestic terrorist, drove up to 3 different locations: spa, massage parlor, and a aromatherapy salon, and shot and killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. And reading about that news and hearing the lament of our siblings today who are Asian American, and Pacific Islander, this Bible verse came to mind. We're gonna open with it and share it with you. In the book of Genesis, there's a story of 2 brothers, Cain and Abel, and Cain murders his brother Abel. And God comes to find Cain after that has happened. And in Genesis chapter 4, starting at verse 9, it reads, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Where is your brother Abel?' He said, 'I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?' And the Lord said, 'What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground.'" Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground.
Wow.
Today, our sisters, our siblings, our Asian siblings' blood is crying out from the ground. And so we need to talk about what happened. And Pastor Johnson and I just want to recognize that we are talking about these events and the history of anti-Asian sentiment. We're talking about that as allies, as folks who are not part of the Asian American, Pacific Islander community, but who stand in solidarity with our Asian siblings and are trying to do the work to show up and to dismantle white supremacy, which is the enemy of us all. So because this topic is so fresh, we're going to talk about it from our perspective tonight, but we also will be back in future weeks with some of our friends and siblings who are Asian folks, people of Asian descent, to hear their voice and their opinion too. But tonight we just want to name, that leading up to this event, We've had a whole year where violence against Asian folks has been escalating. And the group Stop AAPI Hate has released earlier this week, a statistic that said that in this year alone, there have been 3,800 reported incidents of violence against Asian American folks. Now, those are just the reported incidents, friends. And we all know that when we're talking about violence in communities, the numbers are far greater than what gets reported. But in this time of pandemic, we're on lockdown, right? Ain't nobody going anywhere. And we've still had almost 4,000 incidents of anti-Asian violence, of violence against Asian folks. And several lives that have been lost to that violence, even before yesterday's shooting. And today, because it happened last night, when we're recording this today, of course, all day there's been conversation in the racist way that our systems have this conversation about not calling this a hate crime, not saying that this was not racially motivated. Y'all, come on. Now there's an argument that this young man who committed this crime, it wasn't that he was going after Asian folks, it's that he had a sex addiction.
Oh, Lord.
And in the words of my esteemed father, they will just say anything so that they don't have to call it what it is.
Oh, man.
Where to begin about this? I do not doubt or question that young man had a sex addiction. Sure, fine. A sex addiction does not equate to violent murder of 8 people. A sex addiction does not drive you to go specifically to Asian-owned businesses, to drive from your community to another community to attack Asian-owned businesses. That's not sex addiction, that's racism, friends. And even if we are going to be in the realm of talking about sex, then we need to talk about the long history of how our country, our culture, has fetishized and over-sexualized Asian women. That all of the depictions that we see spanning back 300, 400 years coming out of Europe and in the early Americas are these depictions of Asian women as subservient, sexualized beings, exotically beautiful, but definitely other and different and apart from us. And so even if you want to talk about the sexual element of this crime, it still is a result of how racism has taught us to view Asian women. But we can't separate it from the escalation of violence that has been happening in the last months. That's not integrous, and it's just not true. It's just not true. So whether or not the police or the prosecutor or whoever feels that they can prove that this was a hate crime, they don't really have a great track record, as we know in the Black community, of proving the truth about what happens when people of color are murdered. So we're still going to claim, we're still going to call it, we're still going to understand that this is about racism. This was an act of racialized violence, and we need to deal with that. Now, we can have a side conversation, and we should, about how this young man was a preacher's kid, a born-again Baptist, and said that he was committing these crimes to deal with his sexual sins and to remove temptation. That's a whole other conversation that we need to have, church, about what we are teaching our young people about sex or not teaching them and what messages they're receiving because we're not talking about it. Stay tuned for that podcast at a later time. But today we're going to go straight to those racist tropes and assumptions that live inside of our culture that are growing into violence and are being expressed not for the first time, but in new ways among us.
Oh Lord. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pastor. Very well done, very well said. Just a solemn time for us in terms of it's incredible to me that the United States has spent trillions and trillions of dollars on the military to build up this domestic juggernaut that we call our military, to fight an enemy that we perceive is out there somewhere. And it seems to me that the greatest enemy that we're discovering is not out there. We were told by the previous presidential administration that it's somewhere on the border of Mexico, that we need to build a wall because it's our Latinx siblings, or it's our Arab siblings, or it's somebody else out there. But it seems like the greatest enemy is within again. And still, we have not dealt with the enemy within, have we? I mean, that domestic violence, domestic terrorism, as some people have called our Arab siblings terrorists, and have said that our Latinx siblings want something that they haven't worked for. Well, the people that I know that are, unfortunately, when I think of terrorism, I think of white, straight men. In terms of people who have gotten something that they have not worked for. And so this moment that we find ourselves in, where we're talking about violence and calling the scripture to give us this visual of our Asian siblings' blood calling out to us from the ground, is not new, church. I mean, even though we're talking about the 3,800 reported incidents this last year during the pandemic, this is just a part of a history of violence against people of Asian descent by Americans. Whether we're talking about what happened during the Korean War in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. I remember the words of one boxing champ named Muhammad Ali, aka Cassius Clay, who when was cited for being a conscientious objector and would not go into the war in Vietnam, looked at the camera and said, "No Viet Cong have ever called me nigger." So I'm not, yeah, I said it. That's what my brother said. And I mean, what profound words. But there is a history of violence against people of Asian descent, whether we want to talk about what happened in the 19th century and before that, but particularly those that we quote unquote Shanghaied, and the word Shanghai means to kidnap Chinese folk and use them for labor that they will not be compensated for. And they built the Trans-American Railroad in the West. And the whole notion of that phrase "going to hell in a handbasket" was created because they used to dig holes in mountains and then send our Asian siblings into those holes with dynamite and fuses. And they would go down to the bottom of that hole and set the fuse, and then they would pull them out before the fuse went off, they hoped. And quite often they didn't. And so there were thousands of Chinese folk who were shanghaied by Americans and brought here and put in slavery, we might as well say, to build this railroad. And then after, that took place around 1850, 1855, in a 25-year span. And then after Asians or Chinese outweighed their usefulness, then in 1882, we have what we call the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was legislation that was signed into law by President Chester Arthur, who signed into law that Asian folk no longer could enter into the United States. Oh Lord, some say it ain't so, church. It is so. It's our history. Wow. It's our history, not to mention what happened with Japanese internment during World War II, where over 120,000 Asian Americans of Japanese descent were gathered up and put in concentration camps because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. Now, mind you, some justify by saying, well, our nation was at risk because we had just got bombed at Pearl Harbor. Well, why didn't we gather up German Americans and we were in war against Germany, against Adolf Hitler? We did not gather up white folk of German descent. We were in war against Italy and Mussolini. We did not gather up white people of Italian descent and put them in concentration camps and take everything from them that they owned.
My mind.
And so we have a history, and then not to mention what happened in the Korean War, as Korea was divided up after World War II and went into North Korea and South Korea, not because that's what Koreans did, but it was because that Russia and the United States divided Korea into a North and a South, and the Russians took the North and the Americans took the South. And then we say that the Koreans warred against us. Well, hell, they should have. Get out of our damn country and let us determine what we want to do in our own land. Then, of course, Vietnam and the millions of Viet Cong that were murdered at the hands of U.S. troops and U.S. bombs from B-52s overhead. And then in 1982, we remember right here in Detroit when Vincent Chin, a draftsman who was murdered by two Chrysler workers, Ronald Nivens and Michael Nitz, who beat this man to death because they said that he took their jobs.
My God.
Because of what happened between the Japanese automakers taking a lot of U.S. margin share or profit share in the auto industry. And Vincent Chin wasn't even Japanese. Oh, my Lord. And just the whole divide, all that has happened to our siblings of Asian descent in our country and abroad, and there has been no cry no outcry for justice, no outcry for the pain caused these Americans, y'all. They are Americans. And Joe Biden, when he spoke out against the violence the other night against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, said that there are over 2 million Asian folk and Pacific Island folks in our country now who have been part of the first responders in the COVID battle, working in the healthcare industry and in a whole lot of other capacities that we have forgotten about and have not given tribute to or credit to in this moment that we find so many in pain and murdered, y'all, in the face of this, oh Lord.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that is running through that whole history of the treatment of Asian folks in the history of this country is this assumption that Asian folks somehow do not belong, are not American, are different, are other than us, right? So even as far back as the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were families and whole communities of people who had been living in the United States for generations, Asian people who were born here, who had assimilated to American culture, who suddenly were being told that they were not American citizens, right? And the same thing with internment camps, the same thing all the way up to today, when we sometimes, folks in this country often will greet Asian siblings by asking them where they're really from, or assuming that they don't speak English when their family has lived in Southfield, Michigan for the last 40 years, right? When they were born here and this is their home. So we have this idea, this racist idea that has been trained into us that that Asians are somehow different and threatening and less than, right? That they're taking something from us because they're not true Americans. And isn't that the way racism does? Racism keeps morphing, but it uses the same tricks every time. Every time this divide and conquer bullshit comes up, this they're different than you and they're a threat to you nonsense comes up. And so one of the things that we understand is that white supremacy, whiteness, and by that I mean the construct, the structure of racism, whiteness is against everyone who is not white. Notice that I didn't say white people, I didn't say European Americans, right? But whiteness, the norms, the structures, the systems, the culture of white supremacy is against everyone who is not white, who does not fit that narrow description of white superiority. And so one of the things that that this event should highlight for us in our multiple communities is that whiteness is destroying Asian and Asian American bodies the same way that it's destroying Black bodies, the same way that it's destroying Latinx bodies, the same way that it enacted and continues to enact a genocide against Indigenous Native bodies. Whiteness is doing the same destruction to all of us and telling us that we're somehow different from each other. And so we need to attend to that today. We need to do some work around that today. Because white supremacy knows that if we come together, it doesn't have a chance. It will be defeated. So it keeps raging. It keeps showing the ugliness and attacking, because we have the power to defeat it, to dismantle it now. And so in that power, we want to talk about some things that we can do, church, some things that all of us need to be working on in this moment, to be in solidarity, to show up for our Asian American, and Pacific Islander siblings. And the first thing that we want to suggest to everyone is learning. That history that Pastor Johnson enumerated is often unknown by many Americans, or forgotten, right? Why did we fight the Korean War? Why did the United States government send Black folks and Latinx folks to fight Vietnamese people in a country that didn't have nothing to do with us? You know, we need to know that history. We need to know about Vincent Chin, especially in this area, right? That happened in Southeast Michigan. That happened in Detroit. That is our history that we need to know. And often, the experiences and the history of Asian Americans is made invisible in historically and in the present, right? We've had this rising tide of violence, and how many people have, for how many people is this the first time that you're hearing about it? You know, how many news reports have you seen about this? And yet it's been going on all year, right? So we need to be learning. We need to be seeking out the truth. We need to fight against the making invisible, the way our society is making invisible the experience of our Asian siblings.
Right. Yeah, and we, you know, if you check out one of our previous episodes when we talked about the whole problem with binaries and the whole notion of getting caught in the either or thinking and either or mentality, is that binaries create isms. But the issue is that we have been caught in our country in this black and white binary, that we only see oppression as white folks acting against people of African descent, when there are all kinds of other ways and all other groups of people that are being messed over in this country because of the isms, whether we're talking about racism or classism or sexism or heterosexism or ableism or whatever the ism is. We need to be able to look at how oppression happens to a multitude of people who have been pushed to the margins of society. And so this is one of those moments for us as the church, as those of us who are supposed to be the followers of Jesus Christ, who was champion for those who are at the bottom of the well par excellence. I mean, and so where are the followers of Jesus? Where are the ones who are supposed to be speaking truth to power, who are supposed to know this history? And you ain't got to know what happened 200 years ago, but can't you know what happened last year? I mean, we're talking about what happened and all this violence that has happened lately, just to give you the history of what of that last year is not when it began, but the church, we are the ones who are supposed to step into the gap for one another, church. And I think it was the president and CEO of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, that said, as it relates to this round of violence against our Asian siblings, that if one of us is being attacked, we're all being attacked. And we have to have that type of mentality and that type of thinking if we're going to call ourselves the church that follows Jesus. And if we're not, we need to call ourselves something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's the midnight hour for us, church. We know that the white church the Western church is dying, but here's what can come from the ashes of that white church. A church that tears down walls and builds bridges. Where does the hate come from between people of African descent and Asian descent? Where does it, I don't, where the hell does that come? Well, it comes from whiteness and all of us aspiring for the same power that is not only killing and dividing our communities, but are also killing the oppressors that wield it. And so we need to put that crap down and start following Jesus. And that is the power that's going to liberate not just Black folks or white folks, but all people, all God's people.
Right. And so we have to do some work to get free of that training of racism, white supremacy, right? That training is in people of color too. That tells us to be divided, to be separated. We have to think about the biases that we've been taught in the Black community about our Asian siblings, and take those apart, because those aren't ours. That didn't come from African culture. That came from whiteness. That's a thing that was put on us. And so part of our work is to take apart those lies in us about why we should not care about this, why we should be quiet, why we shouldn't be raising a fuss about other people's business, right? Because if we have to understand that God does not desire the destruction of Black bodies, just like God does not desire the destruction of Asian bodies, right? And racism is what is destroying in every community.
That's right.
Our lives. And so we want to stand together against that. In our opening Bible text, Cain asks the question, which has become a rhetorical question for the ages: am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sibling's keeper? And we know from the witness of the gospel that the answer is yes. And so we just leave you with that and challenge you to do your own work, to do your own prayer and research about how you can show up in this time, for learning and solidarity, for standing up for Asian lives, and for taking apart this evil that we call white supremacy and racism. And so we lament tonight that our siblings' blood is crying out from the ground to God. And we hope that you will join us in prayer and in action.
Amen. Can we see the image of God in ourselves and in each other? And so thank you for joining us, y'all, for this first episode of Seeds of Liberation, as we plant the seeds of liberation by telling the stories of the gospel. And so we look forward to talking to you next time, y'all. This is the first episode of our second season. And so blessings to all of you from myself, Mike Johnson, and my co-pastor, Reverend Lindsay Anderson. Peace.
See you next
blessings to you.